very few things that feel as satisfying as the smell of freshly baked bread that fills your house. But if you know anything about baking sourdough bread, you know that's not the easiest thing in the world, and I've failed plenty. But through those sad, flat loaves, I've learned a few tips and tricks that I want to share with you that are going to help you pull this off, even if you've never tried this before. And to make it even easier, I'm going to use the recipe for my go-to dough that I shared with you last time, so that you still use only one dough recipe for everything that you bake.
Here, I'm gonna bring up that recipe on the screen just for reference. On the first day, we started by making a pre-ferment called poolish, which we put away in the fridge overnight. The only difference here is that we're gonna substitute the poolish with a sourdough starter, assuming that you already have one. Not having to ferment a poolish on the first day means that we can start making the dough straight away, and we're gonna be ready to bake the bread the next morning. Now that recipe is enough to make 2 loaves. For the purpose of this video, I'm gonna divide it in half because I'm only gonna make 1 loaf. We'll start by measuring out 175 mils of cold water, to which we're gonna add our sourdough starter. If you wanna know how to make one, you can check out the video that I made through the link in the top right corner. And here's the first tip. An indication that your sourdough starter is ready to bake is that it will float on the surface of the water. It means that it's active and it's full of gas. We're gonna need 150 grams of the starter, which we're gonna mix into the water. It doesn't have to be completely dissolved, but you know, mix it in. We're also gonna use about 313 grams of flour. Pfft, how did you come up with that number, Ro? Remember, we're doing half of the original recipe, which calls for 625 grams. We will then start mixing in the flour, but not all the way. Now, yeast and salt don't really get along too well. That's why we want the sourdough starter to get mixed in with some of the flour so that it doesn't get into direct contact with the salt that we're gonna add in next. We'll need 10 grams of it, and I'm using some rock sea salt that I'm gonna crush, but you can use whatever salt you like. In it goes with the rest of the dough, and it's time to mix everything together. Can you use a stand mixer for this? Sure you can. But like most doughs, and even more so this one because it's alive, I like to get a feeling for the dough. So, once most of the dry ingredients get incorporated, I like to switch to my hands. Once everything gets mixed in, the dough is going to be quite sticky. So if you're kneading it by hand, like me, you can just cover it with some cling film and let it rest on the counter for about half an hour. After the rest, the dough is going to become a lot more smooth and manageable. Just like me, after a nap. It's going to start releasing from the sides of the bowl and it's going to stop sticking to your hands. The way I knead it into the bowl is I pull it away from the sides and into the center and onto itself, all while rotating the bowl. I find that easiest for me, but you knead it any way you find easiest for you. And whichever way we do it, we're gonna keep going until it can pass the window pane test, which is the next step. What the window pane test is being able to stretch out a piece of the dough thin enough so that you can see the light through it without it tearing. That tells us that we've built a strong enough gluten network and we can stop kneading. Form a smooth, tight dough ball and let it rest like that on the counter, covered for half an hour. After which, we're gonna start with the first of a few sets of stretch and folds. You'll see what I mean, but first I'd like to transfer the dough into a wider container. I find that easier for what we're gonna do. So what stretch and folds are basically what they sound like. We stretch the dough and we fold it on itself. Then we rotate the dough and do the same thing on the other side, always keeping the same side up. After we've performed the stretch and fold, we're gonna cover the dough and let it rest for half an hour. The reason why we're doing the stretch and folds is to build strength in our dough. And here's another little tip. Run your fingers under the tap before you do the stretch and folds. The first time especially, it's gonna wanna stick to your hands. Cover it and let it rest for half an hour. As you keep doing these, the dough is also gonna become a lot smoother and it's gonna start releasing from the container much easier. Time to cover it and let it rest before we do it one last time. You'll be able to notice with each consecutive stretch and fold, the dough ball is going to become taller and more bouncy. It's going to be able to hold its shape, which is very important for when we're actually making the loaf. We'll rest the dough one last time before it's time to shape. Now, before you take it out of the container, it's important that you generously flour both the top of the dough and your work surface. I'm using rice flour here, but you can definitely use normal wheat flour. Then with one quick but confident move, we're gonna invert the container onto the work surface. It will be stuck to the bottom, but just let gravity do its thing. At this stage, you don't want to be handling the dough too much. pulling and stretching and tugging at it is just gonna knock out all the air that we've built into it. And for some reason, just watching that feels very satisfying to me. In the end, it's okay to give it a little bit of encouragement. Once it's out, we're gonna grab it from each corner and we're gonna try to gently stretch it out into a roughly rectangular shape. Once you feel that it doesn't want to stretch anymore, don't force it. Then fold in the opposite sides like a little letter and then roll it in lengthwise across the seam. Once we have our little loaf boy, we're gonna flip it upside down and we're gonna close that seam. And then it's time for bulk fermentation. But since there's no bulk and I'm only making one loaf, it's just time for fermentation. We're gonna do that in one of these proofing baskets that's called a banneton. If you don't have one, you can line an appropriately sized container with a kitchen towel and give it a good dusting with flour. We did that in the last video when we were making the sandwich rolls. Okay, now back to our banneton. I'm gonna give that a general dusting with rice flour. And unlike earlier when I said that it's not that important what kind of flour we use, here I really feel like it does make a difference. Rice flour is very good at absorbing moisture, and we want that because we're going to be fermenting the loaf overnight in the fridge and we really don't want it to stick to the banneton. We'll gently grab the dough and place it seam side up into the basket. I like to cover it with a loose plastic bag with plenty of headroom because it's going to rise overnight and it's time to put it away in the fridge.
The next day.
It's the next morning and it's time to bake some bread. Our beautiful sourdough loaf has slow fermented overnight and it's doubled in size. You know it's ready to bake if you poke it and it springs back, but not all the way. If it springs back entirely, then it's too early, and if it doesn't at all, then it's over fermented. Now we'll cover it back up with a plastic bag because while we're preheating the oven, I'll give you another little tip. Put it away in the freezer for about 20 minutes. That's gonna firm up the surface and it's gonna be easier to score. Once it comes out and it's ready to bake, we're gonna give it a dusting with flour. In this case, I'm using rice flour again. And it's time for the moment of truth. Is it gonna wanna come out of the banneton? Be quick and confident with your flip, but make sure you don't smash it onto the surface. We don't wanna be knocking out all that air that's inside of it. Oh, and you've probably noticed that I'm doing that on a sheet of parchment paper. You see why. But for now, it's time to score. And the best way to do that is with a regular old razor blade. It's just sharp and thin enough that it won't stick and tear the loaf. Another tip is when scoring, don't go straight down, go in at an angle. Visualize it in your head and do it with a single confident move. I'm gonna be baking the bread into a Dutch oven that's been preheating, and here's where the parchment paper comes in. I'm gonna lift the loaf with the paper and I'm gonna transfer it into the Dutch oven like that. And then one last thing I wanna do is introduce a little bit more moisture. So before I close the lid, I'm gonna give it a few spritz of water. And here's perhaps the most important tip. We're gonna bake it covered for 20 minutes, but more importantly, at exactly 230 degrees Celsius. This is the optimal temperature for oven spring, or how much your bread is gonna rise. Lower than that will take too long and the bread will dry out, and higher than that will set the crust too quick, making it unable to rise fully. And we'll put it back uncovered for another 20-ish minutes, but keep an eye on it. I pulled mine out in about 15 because I like my crust on the blonde side. There's so many jokes in there. But anyway, proof is in the pudding, as they say, and this pudding is good. Here's one last tip. If you tap it on the bottom and it sounds hollow, then it's baked through. And here's why we scored it at an angle. Look at that ear. That's what that little crusty ridge is called. And this is why the loaf is opened up beautifully as it did. Now I know you're dying to cut into it, but you need to wait. You have to let it rest for at least half an hour.